She smiled, not a polite smile, not a nervous smile, a real one. The kind you can't fake, the kind that reaches the eyes. My husband of 41 years was 3 days in the ground, and my daughter-in-law, Renata, was smiling like she just won something. I was sitting in a lawyer's office on the 9th floor of a glass building downtown, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to bury him, and I watched her face change the second the safe door creaked open. I want you to remember that smile, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why it made my blood run cold, and what I found inside that safe that made sure she never smiled like that again. But to understand why that moment broke something in me, I have to take you back. Back before the funeral, back before the diagnosis, back to the day my son brought her home for the first time, and I made the mistake of thinking she loved him. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I raised one son, Marcus, mostly on my own for the first 6 years of his life, before I met my husband, Walter. Walter didn't just marry me. He adopted Marcus in every way that counted. He taught him to fish, drove him to college interviews, walked him down the aisle at his wedding because Marcus asked him to, not me. Walter was the kind of man who fixed things quietly. He never raised his voice. When our roof caved in during a storm in 2003, he didn't complain. He just got up on a ladder the next morning and started nailing shingles. He ran a small manufacturing supply business for 32 years, the kind of unglamorous work that doesn't make headlines, but pays for braces and college tuition and eventually a retirement that looked comfortable on paper. Marcus met Renata at a work conference 9 years ago. She was sharp, well-dressed, quick with a compliment. The first time she came to our house for dinner, she brought a bottle of wine that cost more than our weekly groceries and told me my roast was rustic in a charming way. I remember Walter squeezing my hand under the table when she said it. He caught it too. I want to be fair here because I've watched enough of these stories to know how easy it is to paint someone as a villain from the first scene. So let me say clearly, Renata was not cruel in obvious ways. She never screamed at us. She never slammed a door. Her cruelty was the quiet kind, the kind that hides behind good manners and takes years to notice, like water slowly finding the cracks in a foundation. She corrected me at holidays, gently, always gently. "Oh, we don't really do it that way anymore," she'd say, when I brought my mother's cranberry recipe to Thanksgiving. She redecorated Marcus's apartment before we'd even finished helping him move in, and somehow the box of family photos Walter and I had given him ended up in storage, replaced by art prints that matched the couch. Small things. Forgettable things if they'd been the only things. But they weren't. 3 years into their marriage, Walter had a scare. A minor heart episode. Nothing fatal, but enough to put him in the hospital for 4 days, and enough to make both of us think seriously, for the first time, about what would happen to everything we'd built if one of us went first. I remember sitting in that hospital room while Walter, hooked up to monitors, told me something I've never forgotten. "I don't trust her," he said quietly, like he was ashamed of the thought. "Renata?" I asked. He nodded. "She asked me last week what my estate situation looked like, word for word. We were talking about the garden." I told him he was being paranoid, that grief and fear were making him suspicious of someone who was, at worst, a little cold. I wanted to believe that. I think some part of me needed to believe that because the alternative meant admitting my son had married someone who saw us as a line item. Walter recovered. He went home. But something in him had shifted, and over the next few years I started noticing what he'd noticed. The way Renata asked pointed questions about our house. Was it paid off? Had we ever considered downsizing? Wouldn't it be easier for us in our later years to move somewhere smaller and let Marcus manage the property? The way she brought up Walter's business unprompted at family dinners, asking about its valuation like she was reading off a spreadsheet in her head. Marcus, to his credit, never seemed to notice. Or if he did, he never said anything. He loved his wife and he loved us, and I think he genuinely believed there was no conflict between those two loves. I didn't have the heart to tell him otherwise. Not yet. 2 years ago, Walter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. I'm not going to spend a long time on this part, because if you've lived through it, you already know, and if you haven't, I hope you never do. 18 months of treatment, remission, relapse, treatment again. Walter lost 40 pounds. He lost his hair twice. He never once lost his temper. Not with the doctors, not with me, not even during the nights when the pain was bad enough that he couldn't speak. What I want to tell you about is what changed in Renata during those 18 months, because something did change, just not the thing I expected. She started visiting more. At first I was grateful, genuinely grateful, and ashamed of myself for the suspicion that had been building for years. She brought soup. She sat with Walter during chemo appointments so I could rest. She asked more than once if there was anything she could help organize, paperwork, insurance claims, that sort of thing. Walter, weakened and exhausted, and wanting, I think, to believe the best about the woman his son loved, let her help with some of it. She reorganized his files. She helped him set up online access to his bank accounts for convenience. She sat in on one meeting with his financial advisor, taking notes, she said, so Walter wouldn't have to remember everything himself. I was so tired during those months, tired in a way that made me grateful for any help, and too exhausted to ask the questions I should have asked. That's something I have to live with now, how tired grief and fear make you, and how that tiredness can be used against you by someone who knows exactly what they're doing. Walter died on a Tuesday morning in March, with my hand in his and Marcus standing at the foot of the bed. Renata was not in the room. She was in the hallway on the phone. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I think about it constantly now. The funeral was small, the way Walter wanted it. He'd never liked being the center of attention, and he'd told me years ago, half joking, that he wanted no fuss, just good coffee for whoever shows up. We honored that. Marcus gave the eulogy. He talked about fishing trips and the way his father had never once in 26 years made him feel like anything less than his own son. I watched Renata during the eulogy. She cried, real tears, I believe, because grief for a father-in-law you've known 9 years can be real even alongside other things. Grief is rarely simple. I want to be honest about that. But after the service in the reception line, I watched her check her phone 3 times in 20 minutes. I watched her pull Marcus aside for a hushed conversation near the coat closet. And when he came back to me, his face had a strange, unreadable expression I couldn't place at the time. I know now what that conversation was about. 2 days after the funeral, Marcus called me. He said Renata had found something in Walter's old email, a message from a lawyer's office about finalizing paperwork, and she thought it would be good for all of us to sit down together and go over Walter's affairs. Just to make sure everything's in order, Marcus said, using her words, I think, without realizing it. I agreed. Of course I agreed. He was my husband. There would be a will, an estate, decisions to make. This was normal. This was expected. I had no idea what was waiting in that office. The meeting was set for the following Thursday, 6 days after we buried him. I remember the lawyer's office was on the 9th floor, all glass and pale wood, with a view of the city that Walter, who'd spent his whole life in one-story buildings, smelling of machine oil, would have found faintly ridiculous. Marcus sat on one side of the table. Renata sat beside him, dressed impeccably, a leather folder in front of her that I later learned contained printouts of Walter's bank statements. Statements she should not have had access to, statements I hadn't given her, statements that could only have come from the online banking access she'd helped him set up for convenience during his treatment. The lawyer, a calm, unhurried woman named Ms. Okafor, who had handled Walter's affairs for over a decade, opened a manila folder of her own and began with the will. It was straightforward. The house to me, a modest trust for Marcus, some smaller bequests to a niece and to the community fishing program Walter had volunteered with for 15 years. Renata's face, I noticed, did not change during any of this. She was waiting for something else. Then Ms. Okafor mentioned the safe. Walter had kept a small fireproof safe in his home office for as long as I'd known him. I'd always assumed it held insurance documents, the deed to the house, maybe some old coins he'd collected as a young man. I'd never asked to see inside it, and he'd never offered, not out of secrecy, I always believed, but because it simply never came up. 41 years of marriage, and there are still corners you never think to open. Miss Okafor explained that Walter had left specific instructions for the safe, to be opened in her presence, with both his wife and his son present, and its contents distributed according to the letter enclosed within. She had the combination. She had known apparently for over a year. That's when I saw it, the smile. It started at the corners of Renata's mouth the moment Miss Okafor said the word safe, and it was still there, small and satisfied, when the lawyer's assistant wheeled it in on a small cart 20 minutes later. Renata leaned forward slightly in her chair, just an inch, just enough that I noticed, just enough that some old animal instinct in me went very still and very quiet. She thought she knew what was in there, and she was happy about it. Here is where I need you to understand something about my husband. Walter was quiet, but he was never foolish. The same man who watched Renata ask about our estate situation over a garden bed remembered that conversation for 11 years. The same man who let her help with paperwork during his illness was, I would learn, doing something of his own the entire time. Something so careful, so patient, that not even I knew about it until that room, that safe, that smile. Miss Okafor entered the combination. The door swung open. Inside was not cash. It was not jewelry. It was not, as I suspect Renata had hoped, some hidden account number or a second, more generous will that named her directly. Inside were folders, dated, organized, labeled in Walter's careful handwriting, the same handwriting he used for his shop inventories for 30 years. The first folder contained copies of every financial document Renata had helped organize during Walter's illness, alongside a second set, the originals, which Walter had quietly had notarized and duplicated before ever letting her near them. Side by side, the documents showed something the family accountant would later confirm in devastating detail. Nearly $40,000 had been moved in small increments over 14 months from Walter's accounts into a shell account that traced back to Renata's maiden name. The second folder contained something worse, recordings. Walter, it turned out, had kept a small voice recorder in his desk drawer during the last year of his life. Not out of paranoia, Ms. Okafor explained gently, but because after that hospital conversation years earlier, he had decided to simply pay careful attention and document what he found quietly, without accusation, the way he'd approached every problem in his life. One recording, dated 8 months before his death, was Renata's voice, clear as day, telling someone on the phone that Walter wouldn't be around much longer anyway, and that she needed to get things moved before Marcus's mother starts asking questions. The room went very silent. The third item in the safe was a letter addressed to Marcus in Walter's handwriting. Ms. Okafor read it aloud because Walter had asked her to. I won't repeat it word for word. Some things belong only to the people who loved him. But the heart of it was this. Walter forgave no one for lying to him, but he loved his son too much to let him walk into his own future blind. He documented everything not out of spite, but so that when the truth came out, it would come out on paper, calm and undeniable, the way he'd done everything else in his life. The smile was gone from Renata's face by the time the letter finished. I have never, in 9 years, seen a person's expression collapse that completely, that quickly. Marcus didn't speak for almost a full minute. When he did, his voice was steady in a way that told me he'd already, somewhere in the back of his mind, suspected something was wrong and had simply refused to look at it directly, the way we all do sometimes with the people we love. Is this true? He asked her. Just that. Renata tried briefly to explain. A misunderstanding, a joint account she'd meant to mention, a conversation taken out of context. But Miss Okafor had already laid the notarized originals on the table, dated and witnessed months before any of Renata's help began, and numbers, unlike people, don't know how to lie convincingly under pressure. I'm not going to tell you this story ends in screaming or dramatics, because it didn't. Walter wasn't a dramatic man, and somehow, even in his absence, the room followed his lead. What happened instead was quieter and, I think, more final. Marcus asked her to leave the office. She did. Legal proceedings for the recovery of the misappropriated funds began within the month, guided by the documentation Walter had assembled, with a patience I am still, months later, in awe of. Marcus filed for divorce 2 weeks after that meeting. He moved back into our old house for a while, my house now, not because he couldn't manage on his own, but because he told me one night over coffee he needed to be somewhere that still smelled like his father. We didn't talk much those first few weeks. We didn't need to. What stays with me isn't the anger, though there was plenty of that, and there still is, some days. What stays with me is the safe itself, not what was inside it, but what it represented. A man who was sick and tired and dying, who still found the strength every week to quietly protect the people he loved, from someone who was counting the days until he couldn't protect them anymore. He never told me. I think he didn't want me carrying that weight while I was already carrying so much else. That was Walter. Even at the end, he was still the one fixing the roof so no one else had to climb the ladder. I think about that smile sometimes, the one Renata wore when the safe door opened, so certain of what she'd find. I've come to understand it wasn't really a smile of triumph. It was relief. The relief of someone who thought the waiting was finally over. She was right about one thing. The waiting was over, just not in the way she expected. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, and I suspect many of you watching have your own version of Renata in your family, someone whose kindness only ever seemed to point towards your bank account, it's this. The people who truly love you rarely need to ask what you're worth. They already know, and it has nothing to do with money. Walter never once, in 41 years, asked me what I brought to our marriage financially. He just showed up every single day and built something with me. That was his answer to the question Renata kept asking in 100 quiet ways. He didn't need to say it out loud. He just left it in a safe, waiting for the one day it would matter most. If this story meant something to you, if you've lived through your own version of a smile that made your blood run cold, tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if you want to hear what happened when Marcus finally confronted Renata's parents 6 months later, because that too is a story, let me know and I'll tell you next time. Take care of the people who show up quietly. They're usually the ones worth everything.